In this video, we will discuss the decade known as the Roaring '20s. The '20s were characterized as a period with a surging economy that led to mass consumerism. The '20s also introduced the world to jazz music and the Harlem Renaissance, redefining art and culture. Women, known as flappers, defied prohibition laws and traditional societal norms. It was a decade unlike any other. The radio had a profound impact on American culture. The first radio station, KDKA, was in Pittsburgh. The radio brought jazz, news, sports, soap operas, and comedies into our households. By 1930, there were more than 10 million radios with 800 stations across the country. The spread of radio across the nation exposed all Americans to the same music, news, and entertainment. It brings the country together, sharing something in common no matter what part of the country we're in. Radio also helped to break some of the barriers brought about by sectionalism. Radio also brought new music and types of dancing, like the foxtrot and the charleston. The man who revolutionized manufacturing with the moving assembly line was Henry Ford. This assembly line had a profound impact on working conditions. Productivity increased, which led to a decrease in price, an increase in wages, and an increase in demand. In 1925, Ford was producing new Model Ts at the rate of one every 90 seconds. When you add in the availability of easy credit to all of the above, you get more cars on the road. Thanks to Henry Ford, more and more people could buy cars. This meant that they did not have to live close to their jobs or mass transit. They could now live anywhere they wanted. This led to the expansion of cities. New communities pop up on the outskirts of major cities. They're known as suburbs. This also leads to new phenomena where cities spread outward, sometimes in all directions, known as urban sprawl. Advertising boosted sales, informing the public that cars were cheaper and credit was available. A special fashion that set young people apart from older generations was the flapper look. Influenced by movie actresses as well as their own desires for independence, young women shocked their elders by wearing dresses hemmed at the knee, bobbing their hair, smoking cigarettes, and driving cars. Advertisers took advantage of this and catered to their desires. Motion pictures began in the early 1900s. Movie palaces such as these popped up all across the country, boosting the popularity of movies. Like radio, Americans all saw the same movies and fell in love with the same actors and actresses. They became instant celebrities. By 1925, movies were the fourth largest business in the U.S. The early films were silent and black and white. The first picture with sound, The Jazz Singer, was introduced in 1927. With the introduction of talkies, movie attendance went from 40 million in 1922 to over 85 million in 1929. There were over 30,000 movie theaters, and most people went to the movies at least once a week. Newsreels were shown that allowed people for the first time to see film news coverage from around the world. Hollywood, California became the center of the film industry, and movie stars set the tone for fashion and social behavior. Movies and advertising had a huge effect on America's manners and morals. It changed them. People wanted to dress and act like the actors in the movies. People could see what the new dance moves were, the foxtrot, the charleston, and they could also mimic them. This creates what we call the cult of celebrity. The first talkie or movie with sound was The Jazz Singer. Here are four major movie stars that attracted thousands of Americans to movie theaters. Clara Bow became known as the It Girl. Girls wanted to be like her, and guys wanted to be with her. Mary Pickford was America's sweetheart. You could see that there were different role models for all segments of society. Rudolph Valentino was the Sheik. Women swooned over him. And Charlie Chaplin was the Little Tramp. Americans laughed at his antics. Spectator sports also created heroes. Babe Ruth was an American outfielder and pitcher who played 22 seasons in the Major League Baseball, from 1914 to 1935. Ruth achieved his greatest fame as a slugging outfielder for the New York Yankees. He established many records, including career home runs, runs batted in, walks, and on-base plus slugging. Ruth was one of the first 5 players to be elected to the National Baseball Hall of Fame in 1936. Jim Thorpe was an American athlete of Native American and European ancestry. Considered one of the most versatile athletes of modern sports, he won gold medals in the Olympics for the 1912 pentathlon and decathlon. He played American football, collegiate and professional, and also played professional baseball and basketball. Bobby Jones was the most successful amateur golfer ever to compete on a national and international level. During his peak, From 1923 to 1930, he dominated top-level amateur competition and competed very successfully against the world's best professional golfers. Bill Tilden was an American male tennis player. He was considered one of the greatest tennis players of all time. He was the #1 world player for 7 years. He won 14 major singles titles, including 10 Grand Slams, 1 World Hardcourt Championship, and 3 Pro Slams. He also won 7 U.S. Championship titles. During his 18-year amateur period between 1912 and 1930, he won 138 tournaments. Gertrude Ederle became the first woman to swim across the English Channel in 1926. And finally, Jack Dempsey was an American professional boxer and cultural icon of the 20s. He held the World Heavyweight Championship from 1919 to 1926. His aggressive style and exceptional punching power made him one of the most popular boxers in history. He is a member of the International Boxing Hall of Fame. In an age of sensationalism, excess, and crime, Americans longed for an idol or a hero that they could look up to. Charles Lindbergh was honest and brave, something the nation seemed to have lost. He made the first non-stop solo flight across the Atlantic Ocean. He took off from New York City on his plane, the Spirit of St. Louis, and landed in Paris 33 hours and 29 minutes later. He was treated to a ticker-tape parade in New York and met the President in Washington, D.C. Why was hero worship so prevalent in the 1920s? Population growth, urbanization, and economic change brought about progress and a fear of change. Most of the literature produced during this period were westerns and other books about nature which reflected traditional values. The result is that you had conflicting values that produced a need to find heroes who supported the old traditional ways: courage, strength, honor, self-reliance, and individualism. As you can see on the map, women first won the right to vote in western states. This was because in the West there was more equality. There were political reasons too. Wyoming wanted to become a state but lacked the votes. Giving women the right to vote would push them over the edge. Political cartoons like the one seen on the right pushed Americans to support women's suffrage. As you can see in the drawing, the feminine ideal changed drastically from the late 19th century to the 1920s. The 1920s was a time of dramatic change for women. They will see their role in society change. The modern woman seen on the right was known as a flapper. Flappers were seen as a symbol of the 1920s. Flappers were young women who defied social conventions by cutting their hair, adopting a comfortable corset-free clothing, drinking and smoking in public, and embracing dance crazes and a new spirit of sexual openness. Young women were bobbing their hair, rolling down their stockings, raising their hemlines, and wearing makeup. Here are some more photos of women in the 1920s. Take note of the styles of their clothing, even their bathing suits. The bathing suits seen in the photos at the bottom were considered too revealing. Many women were willing to go to jail to break social norms. Women also entered new careers. Some women became professionals, working as teachers, nurses, and librarians. Others worked in offices as secretaries and clerks. Some women performed manual labor, working on cars or other assembly line work. Many women worked in the service industry as pilots and taxi drivers. They were just as adventurous as men. The famous female pilot that pushed the barriers was Amelia Earhart. She unfortunately crashed somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, trying to become the first woman to fly around the world. The women's rights movement of the 1920s had an impact on the lives of all Americans. On the positive side, women utilized technology to free up more time to pursue their own interests. They were no longer bogged down with household chores that lasted all day. They also gained more reproductive freedom with the creation of Planned Parenthood. More time helped women gain education, jobs, and allowed them to work on developing their own identity. There were some negative side effects as well. As more women worked outside the home, they spent less time with their family. Without supervision, teenagers also spent less time at home and rebelled against authority with their newfound freedom. With added responsibilities, women became much more stressed, adding work to their responsibilities at home. They also became more assertive, pushing for things that they had never been able to achieve before. And according to some, women's morals declined, as they began to behave much more like men. Marcus Garvey became a new voice in the civil rights movement. He was greatly influenced by Booker T. Washington. However, after surveying the racial situation in America, Garvey was convinced that integration would never happen, and that the only economic, political, and cultural success on the part of African Americans would bring about equality and respect. With this goal, he established the headquarters of the Universal Negro Improvement Association in New York in 1917, and began to spread a message of black nationalism and the eventual return to Africa of all people of African descent. His brand of black nationalism had three components: unity, pride in the African cultural heritage, and complete autonomy. Garvey believed people of African descent should establish a great independent nation in their ancient homeland of Africa. Garvey organized his group in a way that made those sentiments more visible. He created an African Legion that dressed in military garb, uniformed marching bands, and other auxiliary groups such as the Black Cross Nurses. While racial pride and unity played important roles in Garvey's black nationalism, he touted capitalism as the tool that would establish African Americans as an independent group. His most famous economic venture was a shipping company known as the Black Star Line, a counterpart to a white-owned company called the White Star Line. Garvey started the shipping company in 1919 as a way to promote trade, but also to transport passengers to Africa. However, the shipping company eventually failed due to expensive repairs, mismanagement, and corruption. Garvey's message of black nationalism and a free black Africa met considerable resistance from other African American leaders. He applauded whites who promoted the idea of sending African Americans back to Africa. He even met with a prominent leader of the Ku Klux Klan in Atlanta in 1922 to discuss their views on social equality. Garvey's sale of stock in the Black Star Steamship Line led to federal charges of fraud. In 1925, he was tried, convicted, and jailed. Later, he was deported to Jamaica and his movement collapsed. The 1920s saw the emergence of a new genre of music known as jazz. Some influential artists include Duke Ellington, a major figure in the history of jazz music. His career spanned more than half a century, during which he composed thousands of songs for the stage, screen, and contemporary songbook. He created one of the most distinctive ensemble sounds in Western music. George Gershwin dropped out of high school and began playing piano professionally at age 15. Within a few years, he was one of the most sought-after musicians in America. A composer of jazz, opera, and popular songs for stage and screen, many of his works are now standards. Count Basie. One of jazz music's all-time greats, Count Basie was a primary shaper of the big band sound that characterized the mid-20th century popular music. He played vaudeville before eventually forming his own big band, helping to define the era of swing with hits like 1 O'Clock Jump and Blue Skies. In 1958, Basie became the first African-American male to win a Grammy Award. Louis Armstrong was a trumpeter, bandleader, singer, soloist, film star, and comedian. Considered one of the most influential artists in jazz history, he came to prominence in the 1920s, influencing countless musicians with both his daring trumpet style and unique vocals. Armstrong's charismatic stage presence impressed not only the jazz world, but all of popular music. He recorded several songs throughout his career, including What a Wonderful World. Jazz music was just a part of a larger experience known as the Harlem Renaissance. It was an intellectual revival of African American art, music, and literature. It centered in Harlem, a community in New York City. Some famous writers of the Harlem Renaissance included Langston Hughes, an American poet, novelist, and playwright, whose African-American themes made him a primary contributor to the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s. He published his first poem in 1921 and his first book of poetry in 1926. He went on to write countless works of poetry, prose, and plays. James Weldon Johnson was an early civil rights activist, a leader of the NAACP, and a leading figure in the creation and development of the Harlem Renaissance. After graduating from Atlanta University, he worked as a principal in a grammar school and founded a newspaper, the Daily American, and became the first African American to pass the Florida bar. Count T. Cullen was known for his poetry, fiction, and plays. He published his acclaimed debut volume of poetry, Color, in 1925, which would be followed by Copper Sun and The Ballad of the Brown Girl. Also a noted novelist, playwright, and children's author, Cullen later worked as a high school teacher. Claude McKay was a Jamaican poet who moved to Harlem after publishing his first books of poetry and established himself as a literary voice for social justice during the Harlem Renaissance. He is known for his novels, essays, and poems, including If We Must Die and Harlem Shadows. Paul Robeson was a stellar athlete and performing artist. He starred in both stage and film versions of The Emperor Jones and Showboat, and established an immensely popular screen and singing career. Robeson spoke out against racism and became a world activist, yet was blacklisted during the paranoia of McCarthyism in the 1950s. Other important artists of the 1920s included Georgia O'Keeffe. She was a 20th century American painter, best known for her flower canvases and southwestern landscapes. O'Keeffe moved to New Mexico after her husband's death and was inspired by the landscape to create numerous well-known paintings. Jacob Lawrence was the most widely acclaimed African-American artist of the 20th century. Known for producing narrative collections like the Migration series and War series, he brought the African-American experience to life, using blacks and browns juxtaposed with vivid colors. He also taught and spent 15 years as a professor at the University of Washington. Another literary movement emerged during the 1920s, known as the Lost Generation. The Lost Generation could be characterized as a group that rejected the conformity and materialism of the 1920s American consumer culture. They were disillusioned with the comfort and decadence of the luxuries produced in the Roaring '20s. They were also disillusioned with the results of World War I. They saw the war as one that the U.S. should never have joined. The war was nothing more than a way for weapons makers to make large sums of money. Examples of Lost Generation writers include Gertrude Stein, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, Sinclair Lewis, and Eugene O'Neill.